Good morning, Tiger Bay members. We hope you had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Thank you for everyone who joined us last month for our first virtual program in which we had Mark Halperin, who shared his insight on what the Electoral College was going to look like, just some of the election day scenarios. And we did this just a few days before the November 3rd election. So today we welcome you to our second virtual program. And today we'll be taking a look back on what actually happened on election day. I think we're still sorting that out. Several observations here in Florida and various national trends that became evident certainly in the last few weeks. So you know, all members will be placed on mute. If any Tiger Bay members have any questions at the end of the program, just go ahead and tee them up in the chat room, and our executive director, Jay Revel, will go ahead and ask them on your behalf at the end of the program. So right now, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Susan MacManus. She is a University of South Florida Distinguished University Professor Emerita and received her MA from the University of Michigan and a Ph.D. from Florida State. She is also a native Floridian from a citrus growing family. She has authored or co-authored numerous publications on Florida politics, including Florida's Minority Trailblazers, the men and women who changed the face of Florida government, Politics in Florida, 10 Media Markets, One Powerful State. And I must tell you, as a political communications pro, that was the Bible for sorting through 10 media markets and how each are so unique and so different. So that was a lifesaver. Another book, Young and Old, Generational Combat in the 21st Century, and Targeting Senior Voters. She has appeared on every major broadcast and cable television and radio network and been interviewed by major newspapers in Florida, the US, and abroad. She serves on the University of Florida's Bob Graham Center for Public Service Council of Advisors and on the board of directors of the Florida Tax Watch Center for Florida Citizenship. She chaired the Florida Elections Commission from 1999 to 2003 and is Florida's most quoted political scientist. MacManus is not affiliated with any political party, which I would venture to say is why her honest assessment and sharp criticism is so widely sought from both sides of the aisle. And with that, please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan MacManus.
Thank you so much for having me. And it's so nice to be back in Tallahassee, so to speak. I have very fond memories of my undergrad and graduate work at FSU and still love Tallahassee to the max. What I'm going to do is kind of whip through this presentation pretty quickly. I'm a data person, most of you know that. And then we'll go on and I'll take questions. I don't know who's going to win Georgia, so I know some of you want to know that, but I'm probably not the one to ask. But anyway, you could ask. So we started this election where Florida was considered the nation's premier toss-up state. Again, that prediction never, ever, ever changed. Good reason, because 5 prior statewide races, 2 presidential, 3 gubernatorial, the victors had only won by about 1%. So it was natural that everyone expected that we would have another nail biter on our hands this time out. But we surprised the country and surprised a lot of Floridians when, in fact, we went the opposite of the national and ended up not being a particularly close presidential race, with Republicans taking it pretty easily. And if you look at the down ballot races, the Republicans in Florida did quite well there too, which is interesting because it appears that Florida was more likely to vote straight ticket and not split tickets, which was what a lot of people had anticipated might happen. But here it was a classic case of straight ticket voting, whereas in a lot of other states where Republicans did well in the congressional races, it was obvious there was more split ticket voting. But I want you to sort of focus on the gains here, because when I get to a later portion of the presentation, who these gains came from is a very interesting thing about the changing nature of Florida politics. And obviously we had 6 amendments on the ballot. 2 failed, 1 closely, narrowly failed. But the one that got the most post-election attention was number 2, the passage of the minimum wage increase, which, as it turns out, Democrats were sort of less than enthusiastic about endorsing, and it turned out it passed pretty handily in a lot of Republican areas. But it's typical in our state that after one party kind of really gets kicked in the teeth a bit, they go back to the drawing board. And really, if you look at the two elections that call most attention to this, it was after Republicans lost the 2012 presidential that they came together and started looking at devising a better plan. It was when Rubio started mentioning to the party they need to reach out to the Hispanic voters a lot more. And for Democrats, it was the 2018 governor's race, which was a nail biter that they narrowly lost. And I think this is a pattern that you often see, is that the party that really loses unexpectedly often borrows from their colleagues on the other side. And I think one of the problems that Democrats had in 2020 was that they failed to implement the corrective action plan that they actually had devised, which had they done it would have been perhaps a different outcome. But that is one of the realisms of this particular election. And I think there's just 5 or 6 things that already, before we get into the details, we already know that if you do some of these things in 2022, regardless of which party you are doing it at your own peril. And I think one of the biggest themes of my presentation is the failure to really look at the nuances and the population shifts and demographic shifts that take place quickly in Florida and are spread out across the state. And there were a lot of stereotypes and broad use of categories instead of really slicing and dicing Florida into its many, many pieces. Terrible polling affected not only the voters, but also the candidates. And I think it really proved that, knowledge from generic outside sources on what's happening at the local level doesn't pay off in our state. And in-person contact clearly is more effective than social media. And certainly we saw an example of where money is no guarantee of victory. If you don't spend it right, you lose. So let's start from the beginning here. What were the Democrats' strategies? Twofold: rebuild the Obama coalition and focus on COVID-19 once that hit. They had identified some targeted demographics: suburban women who'd voted for Trump, the young voters, but they lumped Gen Zs and millennials together. Focus on Blacks and Latinos, especially Puerto Ricans. And then when it opened up, to send the stars of the party into the two areas where Democrats needed to do well: Southeast Florida and the I-4 corridor. And then, of course, much was made of Democrats really making a go at the senior vote over the president's handling of COVID, Social Security, Medicare, and then the Trump's own style. They ended up having to use grassroots strategies that were somewhat imposed on them by the Biden campaign's decision that they were going to adhere to this: we're not going to go in person while we have COVID. And it forced them, Democrats, to have to use social media to do things that needed personalized, which is registration and canvassing voters. They ended up having to turn to the party caucus structure of the party, which many in post-election commentaries, many Democrats said that just didn't work, that they were stepping over each other and relying upon virtual meetings and so forth. And they rationalized a lot of it, which was the last one here, that they felt like even though they were limited in some of this grassroots activity, that they could overcome it by the fact that Democrats in general just have such a dislike for president that would be enough. And we'll see that it was not. Republicans from the get-go had learned from Democrats and had built a very extensive grassroots voter contact force, which they admit they went back to the Obama days to build this. And they did what one of their plans had said, that they needed to extend and expand their base to Latinos beyond just Cuban Americans, aim at Black voters, particularly Black males, and school choice and charter moms, as well as younger Blacks, and then Jewish conservatives. But I think most of us by now know that their whole plan was to focus on margins, particularly in reducing the Democrats' margin of victory in Miami-Dade County. which is over 70% Hispanic. And so they did this through the anti-socialism message. And their goal was to reduce the Democratic margin, by about 10 points because, and this turned out to be true, they had expected that they would lose some older voter and suburban women votes to the Democrats. And of course, they relied heavily upon personal appearances. Trump, I think, made 14 trips just to Miami-Dade compared to Biden's 4 or something like that, and other surrogates. Their grassroots strategy was in person a lot, which again, Democrats were not able to take advantage of these things, which turned out to be gold for Florida Republicans, particularly the canvassing door to door. They were able to do really targeted issue identification, which Democrats were left holding on to only internal polling or national polling, which turned out to be not so good. And a lot of this was focused towards women and Hispanics, as you can see from the kinds of things that went on here. But I really want to stress the diversity part of our state, which a lot of people from outside Florida, including the Biden campaign, never, I think, really grasped to the level and the detail that was necessary to win Florida. Much was made of this, though, the narrowing of the registration gap between Democrats and Republicans, so that by election day, I think it was only a little over 300,000 vote difference. Too much was ignored of the NPA vote, and I think that that's something both parties are going to have to grab a hold of before 2022. It was true that over a third of our registered voters were non-white, Hispanics 17, Blacks 13. And unfortunately, this kind of broad categorization and polling was what was inadequate, as it turns out. And even if you had broken it down by registration patterns, you can see among Hispanics and Asians, Floridians, that there were very much diversity in terms of their registration to begin with. And that kind of got lost in the shuffle.
Dr.
I
MacManus,
think this is.
I didn't want to interrupt. I know you have some slides there, and I know we were trying to access those so we could follow along.
Right.
Jay, do you have those available?
Dr. MacManus, if you'll just hit that share screen button like we talked about earlier, you should be able to share those.
It's not letting me share it, though. So I'm going to have to get out of it altogether, it looks like. Let me see. Let me start again and see if this works. Coming in. Okay, let's see here.
Sorry about that. If you just click on that share screen button, it should allow you to do it.
It's not letting me get into it. So I really do need to show these slides, though, because this is very critical. It says, let me go back and get out and see if I can come back in, okay? I hate to do that, but it's probably the only solution to it.
If you click on share screen, sorry about that.
I can't get to that because you had frozen it when you changed the way that it was done. So let me come back in altogether. I'll get out of the program and come back, and you can have some conversation. And let me see if that works, okay?
Can you see the share screen at the bottom there?
No, I can't. That's my point.
Huh. Welcome back, Dr. MacManus.
Yes, let's see here.
Sorry for the confusion.
Can you see it yet? So you got to give me the screen sharing ability because I don't have that.
Okay, you should have that now.
Is it there now?
Yes, ma'am. It's coming up now.
Okay, good. Sorry about that.
All right. Thank you so much.
No, that's good. So let me just whip through these real quick. I'll catch up with everybody. Give everybody a good sense of looking at this. And where we stopped was right here at the diversity. And here's the slide that I was getting ready to go to about the diversity of Hispanics in Florida. And Democrats were aiming mostly at Puerto Ricans and Mexicans. They tend to lean a lot more Democratic, whereas Republican Cubans have always sort of leaned in that direction. But the coalition included Colombians, Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, and Cubans because of the anti-socialism. But we also have a tremendous diversity among our Black population. This is why Kamala Harris was sent into South Florida initially to when visits were, and when she'd been named VP for her Jamaican background. They did make some inroads here with her visit there. But these communities also, American-born Blacks are often very different in their culture and how you reach them and message. But these populations from these Caribbean countries are very large now in South Florida. And even our Asian population is quite large. And I know, for example, in looking at the Vietnamese population in the Tampa area, we're really leaning very heavily Republican, which was an unusual facet that unless you were really on the ground, you would not have noticed this. So I think this is what's significant looking ahead is this is what we can expect by 2040. You're going to see these changes in the population. And by 2040, Florida's population will be a majority non-white. So Democrats and Republicans both know that they have got to continue to focus on reaching the increasingly diverse population that is very driven by country of origin more than party. And that's why a lot of the people that we looked at, the minorities are registered as no party affiliation. But I think age was another big miscalculation by Democrats who expected that the millennials and Gen Zers would turn out at a high rate after Parkland and climate change and social justice and so forth. They expected that they would turn out at very high rates, and they treated them as one group together, which we'll see in voting patterns. It turned out that the millennials voted differently than Gen Zers, even though their turnout was a little bit higher than it was in 2016. It was not to the degree that Democrats had counted on to do well in Florida. Some of that was because college is a way that you coalesce and energize people, and a lot of college students were online. I think it's important to note as we look ahead that Generation Z, these younger generations, are already a majority non-white. This is registrants. This is a pattern that you see the interface between age and race and ethnicity that must be attended to. You can't take categories just singularly. You have to look at the interactions between these components of someone's being. It's also true that the younger voters are turning their backs on the two parties. They were a large part of that NPA group that we saw that was growing. And this is another challenge, I think, for both parties looking ahead. Another big story, this was the year of the woman nationally and also in Florida, even though females have been the majority registrants in Florida for years. I think what is really becoming very apparent is that it's Democrats are very, very heavily dominated by female voters, and it's more evenly split among Republicans and NPAs and others, minor parties. It's also true that the gap between men and women, which was projected to be huge across the country this election and was so in a lot more, it was a lot truer in other places than it was in Florida, but here you clearly see that there are a lot more women than men among the oldest generation, which of course deals with longevity of life. This is the story that you're going to continue to see reflected in Florida going ahead. And that is that you really see the gender gap between men and women among our minority communities in our state. And a lot of that is frankly driven by the fact that it's minority women who are increasingly going to college and graduating and getting involved in activities and so forth and running for office. This was an incredible thing about our election, which kind of went unnoticed, was how many women ran for either Congress or the state house or Senate in our state, 177 women altogether. But it's really astounding when you look at the percentage of these women candidates who were women of color. And when you look at the general election, that was the primary. So 133 women made it to the general election, and 21 races you saw them running against each other. But you see that basically Democrats still sort of outnumber Republicans among women candidates, but the number of Republicans this time out was a lot larger than it has been. And it turned out, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the presentation, that these gains in particularly Congress and the state Senate came from Republican women. And the fact that the Republicans recruited more women candidates really paid off in terms of winning some of these down ballot races. But looking ahead at what was some of the difficulties of campaigning in this very challenging 2020, you see all four of these things happening simultaneously, some interfacing with others, but it became very difficult for candidates to really figure out not only how to reach people because of the social media and polling and other kinds of problems, but even the messaging. Now, I, as a political scientist, studied multivariate modeling like every other political scientist and economist and so forth. But over the years as an analyst, I've come to realize that most people, when it comes to push comes to shove, they look at two candidates and they kind of say, okay, this or this. And in analyzing all of the ads, and we had more here than anywhere else, these are the divisions that I could see clearly were being perpetrated through ads by candidates at all levels. And you can easily, if you look through them, you can say, okay, I can see how this one would yield this kind of candidate selection over another. So I think this is something that we are increasingly are going to have to do, is to look at the messaging and what are the things, the distinctions in two categories that you want people to sort of make their choice in. But it's also true that we had an unusually busy year from a news perspective, and news saturation often changes your messaging and how you grab voters' attention and the willingness of people to pay attention to politics. So obviously the impeachment, which at the time everybody was thinking how that was going to affect November, well, it didn't much at all, frankly. Then you had March with COVID hitting full force. And then, from February to June, even though the actual primary and caucuses didn't end till later, till August, some states had their primaries. The bottom line was that Biden had really secured the nomination by February, but it can never be discounted that actually this whole campaign, when you want to talk about, sort of fatigue, voter fatigue, remember it was May and June of 2019 when we had that 25 candidate debate down in Miami, which I was privy to cover. It was the most unusual thing ever for a political scientist to see in person. So we have always been at the center of this whole fight, really. And I love this description. CNN did an analysis by June, and they said that 2020 had changed everything, but it was only half over, because then you had the COVID shutdowns and so forth. And then they started seeing the state by state, protests starting to come about against those kinds of rules and regulations. And then the George Floyd episode hit. So you can understand why somebody would say, we're only halfway through, and yet this is, we've got another half of the election to go. And so August up till the shooting of Jacob Blake in Kenosha, which suddenly made law and order come to life as an issue in suburbia America, because Kenosha was different from Minneapolis and some of the other big cities that you'd seen protests and shootings in. And then the March on Washington, another just barn burner kind of issue was the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the confirmation hearings, so you have almost half of September and almost all of October dominating the political scene, all of that going on. At the same time, you have everything else continuing to go on. And then you had the traditional political events, which were virtual for the first time. I do think that the advantage that Democrats got from the national convention was Kamala Harris being picked by Biden heading into the convention as his running mate. The advantage that the Republicans got out of their convention was the racial and ethnic diversity among their speakers that were featured, which was part of their strategy. Then you get to the debates. Now, by the time the debates start, you already have the Supreme Court vacancy and everything else going on. And I think that the first presidential debate did some damage to the president, particularly with older and women voters. The vice presidential debate helped Democrats with Harris, but also helped Republicans who then were worried that maybe she, very liberal, would be stepping in to the presidency. Then you had the 2 town halls, each one of them bragging about who got the most viewers for their candidate. The second debate really didn't do too much, but there were some takeaways, but not dominating. So this is the irony. All of this money spent and all of this that was going on, 3/4 of Floridians admitted in exit polls that they had made up their mind before September, before any of those major events in September and October even occurred. But the late deciders ended up preferring Biden. And some of that was the debate for President Trump, that first one, and others were the final appearance into the state of Obama and Biden and Harris in person. And then again, when you look at this, how much money was spent after the vote by mail ballots had already gone out, and a lot of those came back quickly and everything, I think you begin to get a feel that people are going to have to reassess if this vote pattern continues about how much money you spend on television near the end of the campaign. And spend money, the candidates did. And this was only in the key states. And it was only in October, actually, that we were seeing the most money of any being spent here. And this was before a lot of the Bloomberg money came in. We saw the most visits of candidates, us in Pennsylvania, because both of us were seen as the 2 must-have states by the candidates. Turnout was higher than it had been since '92. But again, you win battles by winning the turnout battle, and that Republicans did handily. And you see something that's troubling to Democrats. If you look at this pattern, the exit polls and showing the identification of who's voting is slowly going down, and that's got to be disconcerting looking ahead. Only 3 counties really flipped. Here's the point. Exit polls showed that the same pattern that we've seen for the last 3 presidential, with suburban and rural areas going Republican and the urban areas going Democrat, was also the same that we saw in 2020. But telling is a look at which areas shifted. And looking at the shift to Trump, you'll notice a lot of big counties, Miami-Dade and Broward. And you'll also notice some Hispanic counties. On the shift to Biden, you see some of the panhandle counties, and of course the University, Alachua. But you also know that Biden did make some inroads in with some of the military retiree vote out in the panhandle through some of the comments on the military, plus people migrating in there, starting to discover that part of Florida as a great place to retire to. But I think this is the story, is the Hispanic vote. And you'll see the 5 counties that have the largest share of Hispanic voters, Miami-Dade and Broward and South County in South Florida. But look at Orange and Osceola, that's Puerto Rican territory. And that's where the Trump campaign made some inroads, because a lot of the Puerto Ricans who voted for Trump, there were people who'd been laid off of the tourism industry, and they didn't want another shutdown, and the economy was what they were voting on. But we do see some interesting patterns looking at 2016 and 2020, in that the white vote went down and went up for Democrats, and the minority votes went down. But particularly noticeable is minority vote for Trump went up, particularly noticeable among Hispanics, but also among Black men, which is something that some of the Democrats in their post-election comments were talking about, that being an issue that they have to deal with in 2022. Gen Zers preferred, as expected, Biden, but you'll notice that the share of the vote went down, and also their vote for Biden went down. And you also see that, well, basically what happened was the older, the 30 to 39-year-olds, which are the upper end of the millennials, went for Trump. And a lot of that was, again, they're the ones who are working at bars and restaurants and retail and college debt, etc. And shutdowns were not on their agenda. And I often advise people, and I think everybody that's in marketing knows this, you got to look at generation and age. Chronological age by itself isn't going to be enough. You must look at life experiences as a particular generation comes of political age. And so you can see how, if you just look at that life experiences somewhat, you can see why Generation Z voted differently than the millennials who, had lived through the Great Recession and a lot of those other kinds of things that might push them a little bit more in the economic direction. The gender gap here between men and women was smaller in Florida than nationally, and it's been that way for quite some time. The women's vote itself, our women were more closely divided than women across the rest of the country. And it wasn't a whole lot of change between 2016 and 2020 in terms of that. It is a cause of concern for Florida Republicans that it's white college graduate women that they're seeing some erosion from, and of concern. And I think that's something they'll have their eye on. Why did people vote for who they did? Obviously, it was Trump's voters were strong leadership, and for Biden voters, it was a cross between unifying the country or caring people like me, or that he has good judgment. The most important issue, the plurality, was the economy, with 38% of voters saying that that was their number one issue. But you can see the patterns there, that crime and safety, the law and order, not only for Republicans was it the economy, but also the law and order, which came as a consequence of those protests and riots and so forth that occurred at the time, nearer the end of the campaign than the beginning. It's also very interesting that Floridians are still split looking forward. What's most important to do now? You still see this huge partisan split between containing the coronavirus and rebuilding the economy. But this is also, I think, a very interesting slide that needs attention and recognition by leaders such as you that are in politics. And that is that we had a pretty high percentage of Floridians that do acknowledge that racism is an important issue. And if you take a look at that in terms of the share, you'll see this 16% overall of 16 plus 52, the 69% rounded. But the Biden, you even see among Trump voters here, this is important here, over half seeing that racism is an issue in our state, because we're very diverse, and people recognize it, and they don't want it to be a negative to our state, which we've gotten a lot of accolades, and a lot of people move here for our diversity. And so I think people are very attentive to this. So in summary here, the bottom line was ground games win elections, and the Republicans, which had the active campaign from start to finish, even beginning way back in 2018 forward. And the Biden campaign was handicapped, and a lot of handicapped by not being able to go register and actually canvass voters about issues. And I think the last particular comment there by the Democrats came from Congresswoman Frederica Wilson, who was really angry that the Biden campaign never recognized the need to canvass and to personalize, get out the votes among Black neighborhoods. And that's one of the reasons that they've not fared that well in the last couple of years with Black turnout in the area where there's sizable and significant Black presence. The reasons why Trump won, the registration battle, the micro-targeting, the socialism issue was never addressed by Biden, and they certainly broadened that Latino coalition beyond just Cuban Americans. Made inroads with the Black vote, and particularly we saw Black men, and that would also include some Black women with school choice advocates, which also were present in the 2018 governor's race. And problems with turnout, the big surge in the suburban vote towards Biden that Democrats were hoping for just didn't materialize. And the suburban women vote, particularly college educated, went towards Biden, but the rest of suburban women pretty much stuck to their party. And the gender gap turned out not to be that significant here as it was elsewhere. A couple other things about Florida Democrats. Over-relying, and this has been a problem for a long time, and I've spoken with many Democratic activists who complained about it endlessly, is the use of polling firms and outside consultants who don't get exactly what we've been talking about here, which is the diversity of the groups that live in Florida and their cultural backgrounds and their countries of origin. And it's not just their race. For some people, race is a secondary issue to their children, for example. These are the kind of things that pollsters from outside using those broad categories, it just really doesn't work. And again, I think that what we saw here was, again, a lot of these comments came from, I read about 60 or 70 different news accounts from inside and outside Florida, which featured a lot of Florida Democrats laying it on the table as to what went wrong. And one of the things that they pointed to was way too much money spent on TV ads. And I think we talked about it earlier. A lot of it was spent near the end. People had already voted and they weren't thinking about it in the sort of dichotomy ways that would drive people to make a choice if they hadn't already made one. Way too little too late on Spanish language media. I go back to, and some of you remember, a message that was put out by around 90 Biden campaign strategists here in Florida, workers who were complaining at the time that the national campaign didn't get the diversity of Florida's Hispanic population. And this turned out to be one of the biggest problems, and one of the reasons why Republicans won so largely was that huge Hispanic coalition that they built, which was high turnout. And then, of course, the other problem was assuming that the younger voter turnout would go up. It was 65%, just using Hillsborough County as an example. And it was 50-something, 59 in 2016. So it went up, but it was also far less cohesive. And the turnout rate for the young was still about 15 to 20 points lower than it was for the older, which had record turnout. So this was a problem here, but I think that the younger voters, the Gen Zers, which are the issue activists, are going to increasingly really make a difference for Democrats in Florida, and they're going to continue to demand that things be changed. But you have to be careful about any of these groups that we're talking about from ignoring the diversity and nuances within groups, because it causes you to lose. This was another problem for Democrats. Polls were showing that social media wasn't reaching anybody either. And I particularly like the one on the right, which was done in September, early September, which was showing no matter what age group, people were already really annoyed that they were seeing political ads in their social media, and they thought they should even abandon them, or particularly here, you keep these search groups, social media companies, from sharing data that allowed them to be targeted. So this was another problem, particularly with young voters, who that is their primary source of political information. Polls were wrong again. The day before the election, the polls were showing a 1% win for Biden in Florida. Well, you know the end of that story. We also pretty much know what's wrong with polling in our state, using these broad categories that miss these differences within groups. Sample size is too small, doing it on the cheap. I can't tell you how many polls I saw that were done with 400 registrants in Florida, 400 voters, not even necessarily registrants, some self-proclaimed registrants. I would have failed a student in my media and politics class where we did the Sunshine State Survey if I had had any kind of proposal to do that in a state like Florida to get anything meaningful out of it. We knew all along there were shy Trump voters that we're not going to tell a pollster. They won't talk to them. They don't like them. So what you are getting is you're getting a bias of those Republicans who are willing to talk to a pollster. It's not looking like those who are not willing to talk to a pollster. And that's something that pollsters are having to grapple with now. My number one thing is you can't predict turnout. You cannot with a poll. And then we have, of course, the language diversity, which means outside pollsters never use Quinnipiac for anything, I might add. These groups just don't understand the language nuances here. And it was interesting that even both the Democrats and Republicans, and I was interested in how they would use even different languages and cultures, countries of origin in the Spanish ads, particularly radio, that they ran in Florida. We recognize that here, but pollsters don't get it. And then, of course, fewer and fewer people are bothering to answer anyway. And it's not just being a shy person, it's just that they don't trust that their information isn't going to be shared with the universe. And so this is a real problem with polling right now. I think focus groups may end up being a better alternative, looking longer ahead than that. Now, two things I am certain about that I think is good. Thank God we shed the moniker of Florida. We ran our elections great. We are, again, sort of a model for the rest of the country. A lot of that was after the 2018 election where we had so many problems with signature issues and all of that. The legislature came back and fixed that and really saved Florida and allowing the supervisors to run their things through the machines of vote by mail earlier. A lot of sensible things that now other states are recognizing. And in the end, I know a lot of Democrats are terribly, terribly upset and disappointed, but you won the big prize, you won the presidency, but Republicans are saying, hey, we did it all here. And so in a moment of joyousness, I think there's something good for everything. So I'm just going to end by saying that this is my number one takeaway for looking at Florida and trying to figure out how to win, because I do think it's the most difficult state in the country to be able to figure out the adequate messaging and means of communication nuances that you need, because it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle and the pieces keep changing, not only the number of pieces, but their shapes and how they're looking at things and how they're engaging in politics. So with that, I will stop and try to take questions that might come up.
Terrific. Dr. MacManus, thank you so much. I know Jay is teeing up some questions now, but just it's so refreshing to have the insight of a political scientist to take a look at the numbers and the facts and where we are from here. I mean, so many people are weighing in on what happened and how it happened, but you really have to look at the numbers. And when you look at some of those counties that slipped from Trump to Biden and vice versa, it's just unheard of in 2020. It'll go down in the history books. But when you did that recap of what led to September when everybody was making up their mind, I mean, you forget the impeachment, aside from coronavirus, the rioting and the shootings and a Supreme Court justice. I mean, each one had a factor. And to have that recap, I mean, what an incredible year. But thank you for shedding some light on that. It's just fascinating. I know we'll be studying it for years to come. But Jay, we have some questions from our Tiger Bay members.
We sure do. I've got quite a few here. We're going to start off with Lena Juarez asked, Dr. MacManus, how would you analyze the gains made this election cycle by women in the legislature and in local offices?
Tremendous. I think this is a big story that didn't get a lot of attention because everything was happening so fast. But I just look at when I was an undergrad at Florida State, I won't tell you how long ago that was. I was always the only woman, or maybe two, in my political science classes. For the last, 5 or 6 years, my classes at USF, political science majors, upper division classes, vast majority women. Several of them are already running for office. And that's the difference between the educational levels and women. Now, I didn't have a slide in there. I could have easily put one in there, which also shows the huge number of women this time that gave money to women candidates running for office at all levels. It was a record. And of course, Florida is unique in a way in that we have two fundraising arms, one for each party that's very active in raising money for women candidates. On the Democratic side, you have Ruth's List, which has been very successful. On the Republican side, you have Maggie's List also. So these are things that are really helping women decide to run for office. And a lot of it also comes from experience in professional organizations, as women are in business and nonprofits and politics. But I was particularly struck when I made the connection between the gender gap and the ones by registration. And you see that women are now going to continue to be a larger part of people running for office because they're the ones who are becoming more educated and in position to help each other financially.
Next question, Dr. MacManus, is from Tim Center. I think this one is pretty funny. He said, would you care to comment about the difference where Biden won 86% of counties nationwide with a Whole Foods and only 27% of the counties with a Cracker Barrel Old Country Store present?
The only thing I'd comment on is I'd probably rather have stock in Whole Foods right now than Cracker Barrel. Tim, you're funny. I know him, and thank you for that good question. And I had seen he tweeted that earlier, and I thought, this is the kind of thing I would love to be able to just blast out. But I thought, and it's true, you can find all these nuances. And that's why they say the sort of algorithms that the parties are using, they can have hundreds of different elements about you that you have no idea that they have to figure out an algorithm on exactly what message should they get to you. So I guess if I was a Whole Foods customer, I'd think, hey, somebody shares my view of what's a good grocery store. If I'm a Cracker Barrel, think, hey, our food's better. So, what can you say?
Next question comes from Linda Vaughn. She asked, how effective was phone banking on behalf of candidates this go round, considering the coronavirus limitations?
Phone banking, if personal, is more effective, but I would not waste, and I'm sorry if there are consultants on the call on the program here, I would not waste a penny on robocalls. They alienate people, and they also are very offensive. Yeah, it's kind of like social media where there's a private space in their lives. And if somebody has to take a robocall, and particularly older voters, and Pam Iorio, who was a former mayor of Tampa years ago, but before that supervisor of elections, often pointed out, older people, it takes a while to get to the phone, and they can, if it's something like that, it just alienates. And you'll hear some people, and they do it over and over and over again because it's cheap. Cheap does not make it effective the same way that money wasted lavishly doesn't make something effective.
Next one comes from Mary Catherine Lawler. She said, what's in store for moderates who are frustrated by both political parties moving forward?
I think there was hope there for a while that for some that the top two primary was the antidote. But in looking at that, it probably, it failed narrowly, but if another proposal that's more common in other states had been put on the ballot, it might have passed, which is, and I lived in Texas. I had a job at the University of Houston, my first job out of FSU. There they have an open primary where you go and you can choose which party's primary you want to vote in if you're an independent, and everyone gets to vote. And I think that was what the idea was. We need to bring more of the NPAs into the primary process to produce more moderate candidates. And I think that one of the things I would tell the nice person that asked that question is, you see the desire for moderate in the kinds of candidates that, and in the victories of some candidates in some of those Midwestern states where the extremists of either side were losing and people were crossing party lines to choose a person that was more in sync with their moderate middle of the road viewpoint. The problem with changing a lot of this is we only think about changing the party structure when it's election time, and it takes a lot of time to push these ideas through. But I do think if you asked, and if you look at, I should have included an ideological question, still, a majority of Americans describe themselves as moderates.
I'm going to take two questions here and kind of stack them on top of each other, Dr. MacManus. First part of this is from Barney Bishop. He said, what do you think the Florida Democratic Party really has to do to reform itself to make it relevant statewide elections again? And I'll add to it a question from George Wass, who said, how do Democrats deal with that socialist label? I think maybe those are probably both related.
Well, there were two issues, really. We didn't see as much of it. We did see a couple ads, and that was sort of in that lawlessness thing, and the fact of how Republicans chose the, sort of the security and safety as one of their big issues for voting for Trump. The problem was that defund the police and the socialism were by far the two things nationally that Democrats who lost said they have got to figure out a way to overcome those issues in their party if they're going to win the moderate vote, which in a lot of congressional districts and state legislative districts is more pervasive than extremism on either end. And in terms of how you go forward with doing it, this is why I think it's going to start with the midterm election, which is more localized. And then coming up with better ads and allowing, and this was another thing that came through in a lot of the comments of Florida Democrats, particularly those who lost, of saying they weren't allowed to formulate their own messages. They were forced to have to live with these messages that were imposed on them by candidates, the Biden campaign, for example. And they weren't able to really, they didn't have the money or the support to articulate running on platforms that were more in sync with their own district and their own neighborhood. And so I think several of the Democratic candidates that I read said that, we need to allow more formulation from the grassroots up of issues that we run on in Florida, and allow candidates in different parts of the state to emphasize different things in their messages, which of course costs money. But I will say one thing definitively, putting a national boilerplate or template over Florida doesn't work. It just doesn't work.
Next question is about exit polls. This comes from Sue Mullins. She said, would you say that they tend to be skewed Republican simply due to the nature of them occurring on election day and that tilting to the Republican turnout?
Well, that used to be the old saying, but the way that exit polls are done today, they do poll those who have already voted by mail. They're part of their sample. And also those that vote early, which obviously anyone who works with election data, all of you know that you can get that data. Parties can tell every day who's turned in something and track that. So I think there was another alternative that was done this year. You had the Edison Research poll, the one that I utilized. You also had one that was formulated by the Associated Press, which was called Votes Cast, and it produced slightly different data. I looked at both of them side by side, and it was not done. It was done before the fact, and it wasn't done on just actual voters. There's a bunch of other things included. very interesting because it probably gave some more in-depth look at why people voted like they did when they were writing stories. But in terms of looking at it analytically for the whole state, the Edison one was a bit better. There are flaws in all these polls, but I think that you can understand what we saw here. Most people, if you really look at those numbers and you look at Florida at precinct level, et cetera, you can pretty much see that they captured the major themes that we saw in the exit polls.
This next question is from Verlindia Doss. She said, I've heard that you basically cannot change someone's mind once it's made up. If that's true, how do campaigns gain voters? Are they just looking at increasing turnout, grabbing the few remaining undecided?
That is a great question. Probably what changes the minds of people more than anything else is something that conflicts, that's just so egregiously out of touch with one of their high priorities or a candidate's mode of behavior. And I'll give as an example that for some seniors and older women, Trump's demeanor in the first debate was unacceptable. And maybe they were on the edge there, but they were pushed over towards the Biden ticket. And I think that personalizing and you're finding out what people just truly cared most deeply about. And if the other candidate can be shown to be so counter to it, and a good example was the socialism message. And you had a lot of Miami Democrats complaining that the party never understood, not the state party as much as the national, DCCC and others that were funding it, campaign here, that you could see that socialism was very personable to Nicaraguans and Venezuelans. And, they hadn't been that solidly Republican in the past or turned out at the rates that they did this time. But there's an example of just finding an issue that's so relevant. And it can come late in a campaign. I mean, for some women voters, the whole confirmation, like conservative, or women voters, maybe the whole Supreme Court justice vacancy and filling of it and confirmation might have moved women in one direction or another. That's what makes it so hard. It's hard because you have to be able to adjust your messaging in the middle of a campaign if you see something. And honestly, to this day, I do not know why the parties insisted on running the same ads over and over and over and over. I do know that consultants make contracts with how many ads they're going to run. But I used to have my Florida politics students make ads in class, and they were as good as some of the ones that I saw that people paid millions for, and you can change them out in a heartbeat. This is what I don't understand. I think that you have to really appreciate the role of technology and the role of young people who know how to reach people visually. Older generations are less visual in their learning than our younger generations. And that's a classic thing of where get somebody at the table that can, okay, I know how to get this message across. Okay, do it, Opening up the consulting ranks is critical for Florida Democrats.
So a couple of quick hitter questions, maybe real quick before we wrap up. This one is from Bonnie Basham. What impact did the Lincoln Project have on the election? That came up in our pre-election program that we did.
Right. I think it did have some impact. For example, it gave some, longtime Republicans a reason not to vote Republican because of Trump, not because of the party. It allowed them to sort of justify being a crossover. And when you had, icons in Florida, political icons and, former presidents who were beloved by Republicans saying it's okay, we don't need to behave like that. This is not being a Republican. It allowed decision-making to be a crossover voter. And going back to the other side, on the Democrats, I think what you saw there was that having some Black luminaries respected by young men speak to the fact that it was okay, and Black conservatives to talk, it was okay, you know, you've been a Democrat all your life, but to cross over and vote. So I think that we saw some of each of those kinds of activities going on in Florida, appealing to people that are party people, but they just didn't like the candidate. There are some who say that going forward, we're going to see whether politics is all about candidate centered or is it still party centered? Because Trump pretty much has made the focus on the candidate. Will that be sustained? We don't know. I think that's another interesting thing going forward that political scientists and analysts will be looking at.
Maybe a good segue to this next one from our newly minted Senator, Loranne Ausley. How do Democrats adjust messaging based on lies and fabrication, like these socialist attacks and PPP attacks, which impacted many of our down ballot races?
A lot of it comes from finding things that that person that's doing the attacking, or identifying who they are. If you can tell, that's the downside of non-transparency of these dark money groups. I'm really much opposed to those. If you believe in somebody, be willing to say it and give it when you give it. But that's my own opinion, which I rarely give, but I will on that one. Don't think it's a service to democracy whatsoever. But the other thing is that personal contact where people who know you and can attest to you, respected people who have different opinions, cutting ads and saying this is just some outsider group or whatever coming in. And I know, for example, that Senator Ausley is well known in her district, and but she had, you know, a lot of that dark money against her, but so did some Republicans in other parts of the state. It was on both sides of it. But the fact that she prevailed, I think, in a lot of ways does show the fact that she's known and she's active and people know her. She was able to personally overcome it, but not being able to do the personal contact, I think really, really, really hurt Democratic down ballot candidates. And in fact, I think in the middle of around September, right after our primaries and getting in the heat of things, there were several Democratic candidates that said, forget it, I'm not paying attention to what the party says or whatever else. I'm going door to door.
A couple of quick hitter, maybe predictive questions. First one up would be, what do you think is going to happen in the Georgia runoff races here coming up shortly?
Far be it for me to predict Georgia. However, some colleagues and I wrote a book a couple of years ago on the transformation of the American South. And of course, I did the demographic work for that book. And I had looked at Georgia and looked at all their changing economy and demographic makeup and so forth. I wasn't surprised that they went blue. And again, that was a classic case of where Democrats there did what Republicans here did. They registered people endlessly from the time they lost the governor's race. Abrams was the head of a lot of it. I think that one's going right down to the wire. Some people say that you might see a split, that you might see one of the candidates, you know, Democrats win and one Republican. I don't know, but think of the money being spent in that state. And I'm just always have a nagging fear that when it looks like you're trying to buy elections, sometimes that doesn't sit well with people. And I can't help, and I'm sorry that some people will be offended by this analysis, but I do think that there was some of that feeling with Bloomberg putting $100 million in and then another whatever in and making a big splash about it. It doesn't sit well with people. And I'm wondering how much all this money and all these annoyances of people during the holiday season, what is that going to do? I think there's some uncertainties there, but I wouldn't be surprised either way it went in Georgia.
Any inkling to what the 2022 statewide elections in Florida may look like?
Very competitive. Obviously, you can't even guess what the issues are going to be. 2 years from now. And certainly, I think one thing that will be different is the way that people campaign and how they spend their money. It appears on the face of it, if you look at this data, you have to assume that parties are going to have to spend more money on some really good demographic and economic and socioeconomic workups of the areas that they're trying to win in, and to draw better candidates that reflect those kind of characteristics. One size fits all has never fit Florida, and it will not fit Florida again in 2022.
Final question. This comes from member Mike Pate. He wants to know, as a former marching chief, can you still march 8 to 5?
I don't know, but do you see my FSU logo in the back here? I just want you to know, Mike. Mike and Judy were in the band with me at FSU. It was one of the highlights of my time at FSU. We always had great seats at the football stadium. Then we were 50-yard line seats, and they've been good friends ever since. So, but happy holidays to all of you. It's a good thing to kind of flush the election every so often and move to Santa, you know, and the little ones.
Well, Dr. MacManus, thank you so much. This has been very informative, and it was so nice to have a political science who is so well regarded to actually take the time to explain what happened this past year and what's still going on. And you're right, maybe we can get some of your students to change up some of those Georgia ads, because we still see them in Tallahassee, and it's the same old ad after another.
It doesn't make any sense.
But thank you, Tiger Bay members, for joining us today for our second virtual program. This will probably be it for 2020, so we'll be back. Stay tuned for our 2021 programming, and to all, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and cheers for a terrific 2021. Thank you for joining us today. And again, thank you, Dr. MacManus.
Thank you. I always end everything with saying, thank God I'm a political scientist in Florida. It'd be really dull to be one in North Dakota. Thank you for having me.
Thank you.